Salith walked slowly through the wide corridors of the Cathari Council building, her long, pale fingers brushing against the smooth walls as if the cold surface could offer her some comfort. She was aware of every gaze in the room, though most ignored her outright. In her species, to be sterile was to be invisible. A Cathari who could not contribute to the lineage had no place in public life, no respect, no future. She moved quietly, her mind rehearsing the polite words she had to speak, though she doubted anyone would truly listen. The council chamber was a grand, circular hall with soaring ceilings and intricate light panels that shifted colors according to the mood of the assembly. Today, the panels glowed a soft amber, a neutral tone reserved for administrative discussions. Salith was summoned here because, despite her lack of reproductive potential, the council had decided she might assist with translation protocols for incoming human visitors. It was the only role they could assign her, a task that required intelligence, but no lasting consequence. She felt the eyes on her as she entered. Some were curious, some indifferent, and a few sharp with subtle judgment. To the Cathari, her very presence was a quiet embarrassment. She had been declared sterile before she reached adulthood, a permanent status that marked her as incomplete. No one questioned the procedure. The Cathari did not dwell on such things. It was simply her lot, and she had learned to carry it without complaint. Though sometimes in private, her chest ached with a longing she did not fully understand. The council members, all of them taller and more colorful than Salith, murmured among themselves as she approached the central dais. Their ceremonial robes shimmered with iridescent threads, signaling rank and achievement. Salith's own garb was plain, modest, and intentionally unremarkable. It was as if the council wished to erase her presence entirely, yet here she was, forced into visibility. "Your task is simple," said a voice from the head of the dais, smooth and commanding.
Humans have requested cultural guidance. You will assist them.
That is all. Salith inclined her head. She had expected no more. She did not need praise, nor did she seek it. She only needed to survive this interaction without drawing unnecessary attention. But even as she walked out of the chamber, her mind was restless. She had spent so much of her life invisible, and now she would interact with beings who were, by all reports, completely different. The humans arrived a few cycles later, bringing with them a curiosity and chaos that unsettled the Cathari to no end. Their bodies were soft and warm, lacking the rigid grace of Cathari form. Their voices carried emotion openly, unrestrained and sometimes clumsy. The humans laughed, they stumbled over their own speech patterns, and they asked questions that seemed irrelevant or absurd. To the Cathari Council, this was inefficiency. To Salith, it was fascinating. Her first encounter with a human was with a man named Evan Calder. He was tall by human standards, with soft brown eyes and a gentle smile. Unlike the Cathari, he did not immediately assess her by her reproductive value. He did not glance at her hands, her posture, or her expression with judgment. Instead, he introduced himself and asked her what she knew about human language. Salith blinked. No one had ever asked her a question simply to learn from her before. She had been useful, yes, but only as a tool. Now, for the first time, someone seemed genuinely interested in what she could offer. "I can translate basic communications," she said cautiously. "I have studied human patterns and cultural markers, but I have no direct experience with them." Evan nodded. "That is exactly what we need. Experience can be taught, but perspective is rarer. I want your perspective." It was a simple sentence, but it shook something deep within Salith. Perspective. Someone had acknowledged hers. She had spent her life on the margins, told she had no future, and yet here was a human who treated her knowledge as valuable. The days that followed were strange and exhilarating. Salith met with Evan every cycle, working through translation exercises, cultural simulations, and communication scenarios. He asked questions she had never considered, like how a Cathari might express care for someone without using formal gestures. or how emotions were shown in nonverbal ways. His questions were often naive, yet they carried an honesty that Saleth found refreshing. At first, the Cathari Council observed from a distance, bemused by the interaction. Why would a human insist on spending so much time with someone of no consequence? Surely it would fizzle out, but it did not. Day after day, the pair worked together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in long debates about human customs. Saleth began to anticipate his questions, thinking ahead, suggesting alternatives. She found herself enjoying the process, something she had not felt in cycles. Evan, for his part, seemed equally engaged. He did not care that the council viewed her as incomplete. He did not weigh her worth against the rigid rules of her society. To him, she was a collaborator, a partner in exploration, and gradually she became something more. Saleth did not understand it fully, and she was cautious. Trust, she had learned, was fragile in a society that measured value by biology. One evening, after a long session of reviewing human gestures and idioms, Evan turned to her with a question that made her pause.
Saleth, he said softly, would you consider working with me outside the council protocols? There is more to human interaction than these exercises.
I think you would find it interesting, she frowned. Working outside the council's oversight was risky. She could be reprimanded, shunned further, or worse, removed from her position entirely. Yet there was a spark in his eyes, a quiet insistence that spoke of something different. I do not know, she said carefully. It would be unusual, and the council would not approve. But she hesitated, searching for words. I am curious. Evan smiled, a small warm curve of his lips. Curiosity is the first step to understanding. That is why I ask. From that moment, their work took on a new dimension. They met in neutral spaces, places away from the council's scrutiny, where Saleth could observe humans more freely. She watched how they interacted with one another, how they laughed, how they comforted each other. It was chaotic, imperfect, and yet, somehow, deeply harmonious. The humans did not measure worth by productivity or lineage. They valued connection, creativity, and compassion. Saleth found herself reflecting on her own life in ways she never had. She had been conditioned to accept her sterility as a mark of uselessness, yet here she was, teaching, guiding, and shaping understanding between two species. She realized that her value had never been biological. It had been her mind, her attention, her willingness to engage. And for the first time, someone else had seen it. The Cathari observers eventually noticed changes in her demeanor, where once she had moved quietly, almost invisible. Now, she carried herself with a subtle confidence. Her voice was clear, precise, and filled with meaning. She no longer flinched at judgment because she had begun to see herself as more than the sum of her reproductive capabilities. It was not immediate. It was not dramatic. But in small ways, the shift was undeniable. Saleth laughed quietly when Evan told a human joke that made little sense. She offered insights into Cathari society with a nuance that even council elders had overlooked. She began to assert herself in discussions, not for power, but for understanding. One day, Evan posed a question that lingered long after their session ended. Do you think humans could change your society? Saleth thought carefully. She had seen humans bend, adapt, and connect in ways her species deemed illogical. Their values were different, but they achieved harmony despite, or perhaps because of, it.
I do not know, she replied, but perhaps if someone were willing to listen, change could start with a single conversation. Evan nodded.
Then we will have many conversations. And so, in the quiet spaces between formal protocol and council expectation, a bond began to grow. It was subtle at first, like the gentle pull of a tide, almost imperceptible. But Salaf felt it. It was a sense of belonging, of being seen, of mattering beyond the arbitrary measures of her species. For the first time, she imagined a future that was not dictated by sterility. Perhaps she could be more than a margin, more than an invisible figure. Perhaps she could have influence, respect, even connection. And perhaps, just perhaps, she could understand the humans well enough to shape that future, not as a sterile Cathari, but as Salaf, a mind capable of thought, curiosity, and care. That night, as she returned to her private quarters, she paused by the window and gazed at the stars. They were distant, cold, and vast, yet full of possibility. Somewhere out there, humans and Cathari alike were building bridges between worlds, and she was a part of it. For the first time in her life, she felt the quiet thrill of expectation rather than the sting of exclusion. Salith realized that her story, her purpose, had not ended simply because her body could not carry life. It had only begun. The days that followed their quiet meetings were different for Salith. Each morning, she would wake with a small, unfamiliar sense of anticipation. She no longer felt invisible in the way she once had. Instead, there was a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. Evan Calder's presence in her life, calm and unassuming, was changing the way she saw herself and the world. Their meetings had evolved from formal translation exercises into conversations about everything the Cathari deemed irrelevant. They discussed human rituals, literature, games, and humor. Evan would ask questions that seemed simple at first, like why Cathari eyes changed color with emotion, or how a Cathari measured respect. But the answers were rarely simple. Salaf found herself thinking carefully, explaining cultural nuance in a way that even council elders would not have attempted. Evan listened without judgment, absorbing each explanation with a gentle curiosity that warmed her in ways she did not expect. One morning, Evan arrived with a small device, sleek and human, which could simulate human facial expressions. He placed it on the table between them. "I want you to see emotions as humans express them," he said. "Not just the words, but the gestures, the micro changes. It's subtle, but it can tell you more than anything else." Salif studied the device carefully. It showed tiny movements of the mouth, eyes, and hands. At first, she was overwhelmed. The humans had so many ways to communicate without words, and each carried meaning that shifted with context. She furrowed her brow in concentration, taking careful notes. Evan observed silently, smiling when she discovered patterns and raised her eyebrows in surprise. "You understand quickly," he said after a while. "Most humans take years to notice these things." Sala felt a flicker of pride. No one had ever praised her observation skills before. Her body had been considered irrelevant, but her mind, sharp and attentive, had value here. She realized for the first time that intelligence could be recognized without the need for reproduction. That realization was liberating, like stepping into sunlight after a long, endless night. Their partnership soon grew beyond mere work. Sala found herself sharing thoughts she would never have spoken aloud in Cathari society. She spoke of loneliness, of the quiet sting of being ignored, of longing to matter. Evan listened with patience and understanding, never interrupting or judging. He shared his own experiences, how humans formed connections that were not based on usefulness or lineage, how friendship and loyalty could shape lives in unexpected ways. One cycle, as they worked on a cultural translation project, Evan paused and looked at her thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "humans often find ways to make a difference, even if they feel powerless. They create impact through thought, action, and care. Not everyone is born to lead, but everyone can make a difference." Salith stared at him, feeling a warmth she could not name. For centuries, her society had defined her by what she could not do, by the potential she lacked. Here was someone telling her that she could matter, that her presence had meaning. The words felt strange, yet comforting, like a melody she had forgotten she knew. As the cycles passed, their bond deepened. Evan introduced Saleth to more human ways, music, art, and stories of distant worlds. She observed how humans could experience joy, sadness, excitement, and fear all at once, and still find ways to connect. Their emotions were chaotic, unpredictable, and often illogical, but there was beauty in it. Belith began to see that life could be measured in more ways than lineage or productivity. One evening, after a long session discussing human celebrations, Evan asked her a question that made her pause. "Would you like to visit a human community?" he said. "Not as an observer, but as a guest." "I think you would find it enlightening." Saleth hesitated. The council had never permitted her to travel freely, and she feared their disapproval. But something in her stirred, a desire to experience, to learn, to see beyond the walls of expectation. I would like that," she admitted softly. The journey was unlike anything Saleth had imagined. The human settlement was lively, with sounds, colors, and smells she had never encountered. Children ran and laughed without constraint. Elders shared stories freely, and strangers greeted each other with warmth rather than caution. It was chaotic, yet harmonious. Every human seemed to belong, not because of their productivity or lineage, but because of their connections. Saleth felt both awe and envy. She had lived a life where value was measured in rigid ways, and now she saw an entire species thriving without such measures. Evan guided her through the settlement, explaining customs, introducing friends, and showing her the subtle ways humans expressed care. She listened, asked questions, and slowly began to understand that the bonds humans formed were chosen, not dictated, by biology. During their visit, a small human child approached her. The child had curious eyes, wide with wonder, and reached out a hand. Saleth felt an unexpected warmth in her chest as she knelt to meet the child at eye level. The child smiled and spoke words she did not fully understand, but the tone was clear. A greeting, a recognition, an invitation. Saleth realized in that moment that connection did not require shared biology. She could matter to another being without fulfilling a predetermined role. The feeling was intoxicating, a revelation she had never thought possible. Evan watched quietly, his own expression soft, as Saleth interacted with the child. Returning to the council world, Saleth felt changed. The sterile corridors no longer felt suffocating. She carried with her the memory of laughter, warmth, and choice. She began to notice small ways she could apply what she had learned, how to communicate more effectively with others, how to express care, and how to value herself beyond the labels assigned to her. The Cathari noticed the shift as well. Colleagues who had once ignored her began to seek her input. Council members listened, sometimes reluctantly, as she shared insights about the humans that were impossible to ignore. She was no longer invisible. Her mind and perspective had become essential, even if her body remained sterile. One cycle, Evan proposed an idea that startled her. "Would you consider formalizing our collaboration?" he asked. "I think there is value in being partners, not just in work, but in how we represent our species to each other." Saleth blinked. Formalizing a partnership was unusual, even risky. Cathari society had no concept of partnership without purpose, and sterility complicated matters further. Yet, as she looked at Evan, she felt a certainty she had never experienced before. He valued her for herself, not for what she could produce. I would consider it," she said cautiously. The council was skeptical, of course. They could not understand why a human would invest so deeply in someone considered worthless by their own species. Yet Evan's persistence and Saleth's competence made it impossible to dismiss the proposal. Slowly, grudgingly, they allowed the partnership to exist. In the weeks that followed, Saleth discovered new dimensions of life she had never imagined. She learned about human traditions of care, about the importance of choice, and about the quiet power of presence. She found herself laughing more, thinking more creatively, and feeling a sense of belonging she had never known. Evan, too, was transformed. He had entered their world to study, to observe, and to understand. Instead, he had discovered the strength of a mind shaped by exclusion, the resilience of a being who had survived without recognition, and the quiet power of a person who mattered because of who they were. Their bond grew, not dramatically, but steadily. They shared meals, stories, and experiences. They argued occasionally, but always with respect and curiosity. Salith began to anticipate Evan's questions, sometimes answering before he asked. He, in turn, adapted to her rhythms and patterns, learning to communicate in ways that honored her culture while introducing human flexibility. One evening, as they sat together in a quiet chamber overlooking the stars, Evan spoke softly. You know, Salith, humans often measure legacy not in children, but in influence, in the ideas they leave behind, in the care they show, in the lives they touch.
You have already left a legacy here. Salith looked out at the stars, her mind racing.
For centuries, she had believed her life would be unimportant, that her sterility marked the end of her significance. Yet here was a human telling her that impact did not require biology, that worth could be measured in thought, action, and presence. The words resonated deeply. I never thought of it that way, she admitted. Perhaps I have been wrong about what matters. Evan smiled, reaching out to lightly touch her hand. We often are. That is why we learn. That is why we connect.
That is why we matter. In the cycles that followed, Salith and Evan continued their partnership, deepening their understanding of each other and their respective species.
Salith found herself growing in ways she had never imagined, intellectually, emotionally, and socially. She began to see that the world was larger than the narrow definitions of worth she had been taught, and that she had the capacity to shape it. For the first time in her life, she felt hope, not for recognition, not for lineage, but for connection, for understanding, for a future in which she could matter. The sterile Cathari, who had once been invisible, was no longer defined by absence. She had discovered a new measure of worth, one chosen freely, shaped by action, and confirmed by the quiet recognition of another being who truly saw her. And in that quiet, shared space between two worlds, Salith began to imagine a life beyond sterility, beyond expectation, beyond isolation. A life where she could create meaning, influence others, and be acknowledged not for what she could produce biologically, but for the person she had become. The passage of cycles had changed both Salith and Evan, though not in ways anyone could have predicted. Their partnership had grown beyond translation and observation. It had become a shared life. Salith had learned to enjoy simple human habits, the way Evan smiled when he discovered something new, the way he lingered on stories even if they made little sense, the way his laughter seemed to fill the room with warmth. She had also learned that connection was not limited by species or biology, a revelation that reshaped the very way she thought about herself. One morning, Evan arrived at her quarters carrying a small box filled with items from a human settlement. He placed it on the table and gestured for her to look inside. Salith lifted the lid, revealing objects she had never seen before. Small toys, colorful pictures, a few books, and an assortment of human trinkets meant for learning and play. These are for observation, Evan explained, and, perhaps, for practice. Humans learn through interaction, sometimes even adults. Salith's pale eyes widened as she handled the objects. They were so simple, yet so meaningful. Each item seemed to carry purpose and care, even if it was only for entertainment or curiosity. She realized that humans did not separate work from joy in the same rigid way that Cathari did. Life could be both productive and pleasurable at once. Over the next cycles, Salatha experimented with the items. She carefully read the books, practiced the games, and observed how Evan interacted with them. He laughed, guided her gently, and occasionally made mistakes that drew her own quiet amusement. She found herself learning more about humans in these small exercises than she had in months of formal study. One afternoon, as they sat together playing a word game, Evan paused and looked at her thoughtfully. "Have you ever thought about teaching?" he asked. "Not just translation, but guiding others, sharing knowledge, shaping minds?" Salith hesitated. Teaching implied responsibility, leadership, and influence, concepts she had long believed were denied to her because of her sterility. Her species had always equated worth with the ability to produce descendants, and she had been excluded from every role that mattered.
I have not considered it, she admitted. Why would anyone want me to teach? Because you are capable, Evan replied softly.
You notice things others miss. You understand nuance. And you care? Salith felt a warmth rise in her chest. She had never heard such words before, never in the formal cold halls of her society. Care was not a measure of worth in Cathari culture. It was expected to be efficient, calculated, and useful. Yet here was someone telling her that her compassion, her attention, her mind were reasons enough to teach. The idea took root, quietly. Salith began to think about what she could offer beyond translation. She considered the younger Cathari, the ones still learning about their culture, who were often overlooked by elders because of their strict focus on lineage. Perhaps she could guide them, mentor them, help them understand that value was not solely biological. Evan encouraged her every step of the way. He suggested exercises for learning, ways to connect with younger Cathari, and techniques for observing without judging. Together, they crafted lessons that combined human curiosity with Cathari precision. It was unconventional, but it worked. Salith saw the younger ones respond with interest and excitement, asking questions and sharing ideas she had never imagined. One day, as she observed a group of young Cathari experimenting with communication patterns, she realized something extraordinary. She felt a connection to these children not because of biology, but because of influence. Her guidance, patience, and presence were shaping minds, creating understanding, and leaving a lasting impact. For the first time, she experienced the joy of motherhood, not in the biological sense, but in the way humans often described it: nurturing, teaching, caring, and being present. The realization filled her with awe. She had long believed that sterility meant exclusion from meaningful roles. Yet here she was, touching lives, inspiring growth, and creating bonds that would outlast any council decree. Her worth had never been diminished. It had only been invisible to those who refused to see beyond biology. Evan watched her quietly, sensing the change. "You're remarkable, Salith," he said one evening, as they reviewed the day's lessons. "Not because of what you lack, but because of what you give. You've become more than you knew you could be." Salith looked at him, feeling a mixture of gratitude and wonder. She had learned to survive in a world that measured worth in narrow terms, and now she was learning to thrive in a world where influence and care mattered. She realized that humans had not only shown her a different way of thinking, they had given her permission to redefine herself. As cycles passed, their bond deepened further. They shared quiet meals, long walks through the council's gardens, and evenings under the stars discussing philosophy, ethics, and culture. Salith began to feel emotions she had never named: anticipation, joy, curiosity, and the faint warm stirring of attachment. Evan, too, seemed to change. He grew more attuned to Cathari customs, more patient in his explanations, and more deeply invested in understanding the nuances of their society. One morning, Evan proposed a new idea. "There's a human child in our habitat," he said. "Due to relocation and travel, the child will be without proper supervision for a while. I think we could care for them together, even temporarily. Would you help?" Solace's heart skipped. The notion of caring for a child was daunting. In Cathari society, she would never be allowed to raise offspring. Yet here was a chance to nurture life, to create bonds without needing biology. She considered the implications and felt a strange mixture of fear and excitement. I would try, she said softly. The child arrived the next cycle, a small being with curious eyes and boundless energy. Saleth was cautious at first, unsure how to respond. She observed the child's movements, listened to their sounds, and mirrored expressions, learning communication in real time. Evan guided her gently, showing her how humans expressed care through actions, not commands. To her surprise, the child bonded with her immediately. They reached for her hands, laughed at her mistakes, and clung to her presence. Saleth felt a warmth she had never known, a connection that transcended species and biology. It was a profound revelation. Motherhood was not limited to biology, but was expressed through attention, patience, guidance, and love. Days turned into weeks, and Saleth discovered a natural rhythm in caring for the child. She learned to anticipate needs, comfort fears, and encourage curiosity. The child responded with trust, laughter, and affection, reinforcing Saleth's sense of purpose. She felt a quiet pride, a deep satisfaction that her influence mattered. She was no longer invisible. She was essential to this child's world. The Cathari Council observed these interactions with cautious curiosity. They expected detachment, failure, or indifference, yet none occurred. Saleth's care was deliberate, thoughtful, and consistent. The child thrived under her guidance, learning, exploring, and forming bonds not only with Saleth, but with the humans and Cathari around them. Evan noticed the council's surprise and smiled, quietly. "They will never admit it," he said, "but they are witnessing something extraordinary. You've redefined what value means in their eyes, Saleth." Saleth considered this. For centuries, she had been judged solely by her inability to reproduce. Now she was influencing a life, shaping understanding, and creating bonds that transcended expectation. Her worth was measured not by biology, but by care, intellect, and connection. The realization filled her with a sense of fulfillment she had never imagined. As they continued their work, Saleth and Evan's bond evolved further. It was no longer just partnership or mentorship. It had become a shared life, a mutual investment in learning, growth, and connection. They laughed together, debated ideas, and supported each other's discoveries. Saleth realized that she had found a companion who valued her for herself, not for what she could produce. One evening, as they watched the stars shimmer across the council's observation deck, Evan spoke softly.
You know, Saleth, humans often say that family is chosen, not given.
"I think you are discovering that for yourself." Saleth looked out at the stars, the child's laughter echoing faintly from the gardens below. She understood now what he meant. Family, worth, and legacy were not limited to biology or social expectation. They were created through care, presence, and connection. She had found a new kind of family, one that embraced her fully, and a new measure of worth that was hers alone to define. In those quiet moments, she realized that her journey had only just begun. She had been shunned by her own species, denied the roles that others took for granted, and told that her life would be incomplete. Yet, through patience, curiosity, and connection, she had discovered a life richer than she had ever imagined. She had learned to matter, to nurture, and to influence. She had found joy, purpose, and belonging, all without conforming to the narrow definitions of her society. Saleth understood now that sterility had never defined her. What mattered was her mind, her heart, her willingness to care, and the bonds she created. And as the cycles passed, she realized that she was not only a guide, a teacher, or a caretaker. She was a pioneer of a new way of being, one that blended human freedom with Cathari wisdom, creating a bridge between worlds that had never existed before. The cycles had turned slowly, almost imperceptibly, yet everything had changed. Saleth, once invisible and dismissed, had discovered a life she never thought possible. Her days were filled with teaching, caring, and exploring alongside Evan and the small human child they now shared responsibility for. The quiet rhythm of their lives contrasted sharply with the rigid structure of Cathari society. Yet within that rhythm, Solith had found a freedom she had never imagined. The child's laughter filled the halls of their shared quarters, echoing against walls that had once seemed oppressive and cold. Solith watched, a small smile playing on her lips, as the child stumbled through a game of human origin, tripping and recovering with unrestrained joy. Evan stood nearby, gently guiding and encouraging, his eyes warm and full of pride. Solith felt a swell of emotion she had never experienced before, a sense of belonging, purpose, and love. Caring for the child had transformed her understanding of motherhood. It was not tied to biology, as the Cathari had always insisted, but to presence, patience, and consistent care. She learned to anticipate needs, offer guidance without control, and provide comfort without demanding perfection. Each day the child responded with trust and affection, creating a bond stronger than she had ever thought possible. Salabeth began to see herself not as someone denied life, but as someone capable of nurturing it in her own way. Evan noticed the subtle changes in her demeanor. She moved with confidence now, her voice carrying calm authority, and her attention to detail inspired both Cathari and human collaborators. He watched her interact with the child and thought quietly about how extraordinary she was, not only in skill, but in heart. For the first time, he felt that the concept of family was more than a human ideal. It was something he had witnessed being built across species without constraint. One morning, as the child played nearby, Evan approached Solith with a new idea. "The council has been watching," he said gently, "and I think they are beginning to understand something important. They've seen how much influence you have and how capable you are at nurturing. Perhaps it's time to formalize your role, legally, socially, and culturally." Solith. Pale eyes widened. She had expected caution, skepticism, and perhaps rejection. But Evan's words carried hope. "Formally?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Not because they can't see your value, but because your work, your care, deserves recognition. You've changed the way both Cathari and human societies understand what matters. You've created a new path, and it's time to honor it." The council meeting was unlike any she had attended before. The grand chamber felt smaller somehow, as if the weight of tradition and expectation was giving way to possibility. The Cathari elders, draped in their ceremonial robes, observed silently as Solith stepped forward. She felt a moment of hesitation, but then she remembered the laughter of the child, the curiosity of the younger Cathari she had guided, and the warmth of Evan's presence. "I have been given many roles," she began softly, "but none have measured my worth in ways that truly matter. I have cared for life, guided learning, and shaped understanding, not because I could produce descendants, but because I chose to give myself fully. And in doing so, I have discovered that worth is not measured biologically, but through action, presence, and connection." A ripple of quiet murmurs passed through the chamber. Some Cathari frowned, struggling to understand, while others exchanged uncertain glances. Yet no one interrupted. Solith's voice carried clarity and conviction, and the truth of her words could not be ignored. "I ask that my contributions be recognized," she continued. "Not as a breeder, not as someone who fulfills expectation, but as someone who shapes lives, nurtures minds, and builds connections that endure beyond biology." For a long moment, silence held the chamber. Then, slowly, the eldest council member nodded. Perhaps we have been wrong," he said quietly. "Value has never been solely in reproduction. Influence, care, and presence. These are worth recognizing. Salith, your work has changed the way we think about life, connection, and society." "You are acknowledged." Salith felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Recognition was not what she had sought. It was the affirmation that her choices, her care, and her presence mattered. The council members who had once ignored her now regarded her with a quiet respect, a reflection of the transformation she had quietly accomplished. Returning to their quarters, Saleth found the child waiting, full of questions and excitement. Evan smiled as he watched her interact, noticing the ease, confidence, and warmth that now defined her presence. The child reached for her hand, and she held it without hesitation, feeling the deep connection that had grown over countless cycles. "I am proud of you," Evan whispered, as they watched the child explore a new game. "Not because of recognition, but because of who you are." Saleth smiled, a quiet, contented smile. "I have learned," she said softly, "that worth is not given. It is created, nurtured, and shared." The following cycles brought further changes. Saleth's role expanded beyond the household and teaching. She began to mentor Cathari youths formally, guiding them not through the rigid structures of society, but through curiosity, thought, and empathy. The younger generation responded eagerly, fascinated by a being who defied traditional expectations and demonstrated the power of choice, presence, and care. The child they cared for grew rapidly, learning both human and Cathari ways, absorbing knowledge, culture, and love. Saleth marveled at the development, realizing that the small acts of guidance, patience, and encouragement had created a life full of potential, joy, and curiosity. She understood now that motherhood, in its truest sense, was not biological. It was expressed through consistent care, guidance, and the quiet shaping of another life. One evening, as the three of them sat under the observation deck, looking at stars scattered across the sky like glittering dust, Evan spoke softly. "So, do you see what you've done? You've bridged worlds, nurtured life, and reshaped understanding. Humans call this family, and I think you've created it across species." Saleth felt a swell of emotion she had never named before. Pride, love, belonging, and fulfillment intertwined. I think I understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Family is not given. It is chosen, nurtured, and sustained. It is care, presence, and connection. I have been part of creating that." Evan reached out and took her hand gently. "You have. And you will continue to do so in ways no one could have imagined." As cycles continued, the council gradually embraced this new understanding. Cathari culture, once rigid and unyielding, began to shift. Influence, guidance, and care were slowly recognized as valuable contributions, and the younger generation began to emulate Saleth's example. Where once sterility had meant exclusion, it now held no bearing on worth. Saleth, once shunned and dismissed, became a symbol of change. She had shown that life could be meaningful beyond biology, that influence and care mattered more than rigid definitions, and that connections could transcend species boundaries. Her partnership with Evan and the child they nurtured together became a living example of what was possible when societies allowed compassion, thought, and curiosity to guide understanding. One quiet morning, as she watched the child practice human songs and Evan encouraged experimentation, Saleth reflected on her journey. She had been invisible, dismissed, and denied by her society. Yet through patience, courage, and connection, she had discovered a life rich in purpose, recognition, and love. She understood now that her worth had never been diminished. It had only been waiting to be recognized in new ways. The cycles continued, but Saleth no longer felt the weight of exclusion. She moved with quiet confidence, her voice carrying clarity and authority. Her mind sharp and alive, her heart open and connected. She had become a mother in the truest sense, a teacher, a guide, and a pioneer of understanding between species. Her life was full, meaningful, and endlessly expansive. Evan watched her with admiration, knowing that she had reshaped not only her own destiny, but the understanding of life, care, and connection for countless others. The child ran forward, laughing, and Salith scooped them into her arms, feeling the warmth, trust, and love that had become her world. I never imagined it could be like this, she whispered, smiling. That worth could be chosen, that life could be nurtured, that connection could create family. You've shown us all what is possible, he said. Not by force, not by expectation, but by being who you truly are. You've made a difference that will last generations. Salith looked at the stars, at the child in her arms, and at the human beside her. For the first time in her long life, she felt complete, not because she had fulfilled a biological expectation, but because she had discovered the true meaning of life: care, connection, and the courage to shape one's own worth. And in that quiet, shared space between species, Salith realized that she had become more than she ever could have imagined. She was a mother, a teacher, a guide, and a bridge between worlds. She was valued, loved, and essential. Not for what she could produce biologically, but for the life, hope, and understanding she nurtured every day. Her story, once defined by exclusion and limitation, had transformed into one of connection, possibility, and enduring impact. And as the cycles continued, Salith embraced each day with quiet joy, knowing that she had created a legacy far greater than lineage, a legacy of care, understanding, and love that would endure across species and generations.